Good evening, and welcome to 7 Stories Up. Corey Brettschneider with Emily Zackin. The Presidents and the People, 5 leaders who threatened democracy and the citizens who fought to defend it. We are delighted to have you all joining us tonight at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Peter Amandi. I saw many of you out there already. And I'm a supervising librarian here at the library. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this evening conversation possible. Also, I would like to remind you that if you don't already have a library card, which I hope most of you do, you can see any information desk downstairs. And I would like to also encourage you to visit NYPL's website and take a look at all our upcoming programs. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Corey Brettschneider is a professor at Brown University, where he teaches constitutional law and politics. He has written for the New York Times, Politico, the Washington Post, and Time, and is the author of the book, The Oath and the Office, and he resides in New York. Emily Zackin is an associate professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Zackin's research focuses on constitutional theory and American political development. Her book, Looking for Rights in All the Wrong Places, Why State Constitutions Contain America's Positive Rights, highlights America's neglected positive rights tradition and explores its origins in a variety of social movements. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome our guests.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Corey, I was hoping you could start us off by give us a short 5-minute description of the book and its argument.
Thanks so much, and thank you all for coming. We're living, obviously, in a historic moment, and this is an attempt to talk about the history that's really beyond and kind of tells the story of the current threat by thinking about previous threats to democracy. And the idea is we are facing a threat to democracy, specifically from someone who was the president and might be the president again, but we've been here before. Now, how have we been here before? There are 5 instances that I give in the book of presidents who threatened democracy, and the idea is that it's not just that these were bad people, but they reveal a kind of danger of the presidency itself. So let me just tell you what Patrick Henry at the founding said. Patrick Henry, the revolutionary hero, opposed the ratification of the Constitution. Why? He said, the problem with this Constitution, if you ratify it, is that the presidency is a kind of loaded gun. The presidency assumed it's so powerful that a person of virtue will occupy the office. But he said, what if a criminal president, somebody who really is using the office for his or her own self-interest in the most crude sense, gets a hold of this office? What's going to happen? They're going to realize there are no checks on them. The court is supposed to be a check, but Henry predicted it wouldn't work. Congress is supposed to be a check with impeachment, but that won't work. And so that person will realize that their power is really unlimited until, and now here's the thing that until recently people thought seemed like hyperbole, couldn't be true. That person will crown themselves a monarch. That's the language that he uses. So the idea of the book is that hasn't happened, but it has almost happened. Things like it have happened. So take, for instance, the second president, John Adams, who's often lauded in the way we tell the story of the presidency. What John Adams did was he lobbied for and signed the Alien and Sedition Acts. And the Sedition Act specifically gave him the power which he used to go after his critics. And just to see how the Sedition Act is written in this way, it allowed for criticism of the vice president of the United States, but made it a crime to criminalize criticizing the president. Now, why would you do it that way? The vice president, Thomas Jefferson, is a member of the opposition party. And so it's legislation that gives him the power which he uses to go after his critics. He passes this law or signs the bill and urges the law to be passed in retaliation for a plot to try to undermine the Electoral College, to deny the certification of electoral votes with a committee that would throw the election to him and the Federalist Party. Also sounds familiar. President Buchanan lobbies the Supreme Court to decide the Dred Scott case, to deny all rights to black Americans, and succeeds, really cutting off the possibility of a multiracial democracy. Woodrow Wilson, who we have often celebrated in the book, I talk about how he didn't just, and it's well known that he resegregated the federal government, but I talk about his constitutional philosophy as one being a combination of nationalism and white supremacy. And then finally, Richard Nixon, who I try to tell the story in part through interviews with the grand jurors who tried to indict Nixon of the vast crimes that he committed that really aren't known beyond Watergate, including the threat to incapacitate, kill Daniel Ellsberg on the Capitol steps, including the attempted break-in at the Brookings Institution. But as you'll hear as we get into our conversation today, and I'm really so lucky to have Emily, who's one of the top political scientists in the world, most astute thinkers about how to think about politics and history together, to think about the hope, too, and that's part of what we're going to talk about. Because in each of these instances, as dire as they were, citizens fought back, and they succeeded not through court cases, not through the Supreme Court, but by forming constitutional constituencies that got behind recovery presidents and put democracy back on the table. All of these presidents had authoritarian ideas of the Constitution. We've seen that recently with the immunity case. And the citizens were the ones who said, we have to democratize this idea of the Constitution, restore democracy by getting behind recovery presidents who will put back ideals like the right to dissent, challenged by Adams, the idea of equal citizenship, in particular, Frederick Douglass, the champion of that idea against presidents who really rejected it. Against Woodrow Wilson, people like William Monroe Trotter and Ida B. Wells, who maybe you've heard of, and people who you certainly haven't heard of, like Sadie Alexander, fought to create equal citizenship, to get rid of American apartheid, sometimes called segregation. And we'll talk, too, about the last episode, the Nixon episode, and the attempt of Ellsberg, and I'll tell you about my interview with him, the grand jurors, two of whom are still alive and who I was able to speak to, who tried to indict that president, but who were stopped by the pardon. And the argument that I'll make as we get into the conversation is that we really never recovered from the Nixon presidency because of the failure to prosecute him. So we'll talk about that and how the immunity decision and other recent events fit into that question. So thanks, Emily. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. We'll talk for a while and then look forward to your questions.
Absolutely. As you can already tell, Corey's a remarkable storyteller. So the first thing I want to say about the book is it's unbelievably readable. It's a real page turner. The next thing I want to say is that although you've ended your introductory comments on this note about how we never recovered, I do think there's reason to hope here, and I assume that many of you are like me and desperate for reasons to hope. So I thought usually when I do these things, I end with a question about should we be optimistic? But I thought we'd just dive in. Let's just start. Can you give us some hope based on the research you present here?
Yeah, I wouldn't have written the book if it really was about, look how dire this is. The presidency is a loaded gun. We've armed it with the highest caliber weapons imaginable, highest caliber bullets, and let's give up. That's not the idea of the book. The idea is that if you look to history, we've had these moments that are as dire as the one that we currently face, and in some ways, at least as dire, and maybe even more. Think of that Dred Scott case. I mean, Frederick Douglass is hunted down by a president. He has to flee the United States in order to make his arguments, to avoid prison in England. And he gives this idea of constitutional recovery. He says, for instance, and it's all about our Constitution is going to be used to recover America and American democracy from these presidents who are threatening it. And so just to lay it out, what President Buchanan and the court say in the Dred Scott case is if you read the Declaration of Independence, if you read the Constitution, it's all about protecting slavery. So there's really no rights. Black people aren't even citizens under the Constitution. That's Buchanan's argument. And Douglass fights back by saying, look, at the preamble, it doesn't say we the white people. It says we the people. And if you look at the Declaration, it talks about equality without conditions on it. It doesn't say equality of white people. And he uses that principled way of thinking about the Constitution, not to argue in court, but to galvanize America behind this idea. Now, the incredible thing, the hopeful thing, is that even at the moment when Lincoln is elected, he's far from Douglas's view. He thinks that slavery is protected, at least within the states, and can't just be abolished nationally. But Douglas begins to engage in dialogue with him about these ideas, these constitutional ideas, which Lincoln takes so seriously, and starts to bring him over. But it's really during the Grant presidency that you get the election of a president through the constituency that Douglas has helped to build. Black Americans who risked their lives, really, in this unknown election that should be known, 1868, to come out and elect Grant. Why? Not because they thought Grant was some amazing person personally, but because he was pledging not only to support the 15th Amendment and its guarantee of a right to vote, but the enforcement acts, which were used by his Justice Department to prosecute over 1,000 white terrorists, members of the Ku Klux Klan. So we were in a dire, dire moment. Think of how I started that story with Buchanan. Look at where we went to. The election of Grant, the real vindication of the idea of equal citizenship. And that's true in the other stories, too. It's true of the newspaper editors who brilliantly use their own trials. They're being put on trial for criticizing the President of the United States' policies. And they use the trials to put Adams on trial, to make the point that we have to recover the First Amendment right to free speech as a democratic idea of the right to dissent. And that's true during, of course, the Long March, the Civil Rights Movement, people like Sadie Alexander, and people like King, who we rightly celebrate, for thinking about the constitutional idea of American democracy in opposition to the views held by presidents like Woodrow Wilson, which really are authoritarian. So my point is, here's the hope. In all these moments, it was so dire, and yet we recovered. So I'm confident that we can do it again.
Okay, that's a great start. I like it. But let's go back for a minute to talk about you say in the book, and you said it again just now, the presidency is a loaded gun. That's scary sounding.
Yeah.
What do you mean when you say it's a loaded gun?
Well, let's think about the usual story that many of us heard in junior high school or in high school, the civic story, which is checks and balances. If you know anything about American democracy, you've heard that phrase. Now, what are the checks and balances supposed to be? The first check is supposed to be a Supreme Court which looks at a president and asks whether or not his or her actions comport with the text and principles of the Constitution. But what happened to that check throughout American history? Take the Sedition Act. Samuel Chase, a member of the Supreme Court, goes around America, goes to Congress, lobbying for the Sedition Act. He wants it. He sits on the trial of Thomas Cooper, one of the editors who criticized Adams, and ensures that he's convicted by denying him the right to even raise the right to free speech at trial. Buchanan, as I said, lobbies the Supreme Court, which decides easily the most evil opinion in American history. Woodrow Wilson is really defending a version, making it worse, but defending a version of the Plessy case. So these are all instances where the court was supposed to check, and it didn't. That's not where the recoveries came from. Think of Congress, Andrew Johnson, who I talk about, who in the midst of the recovery that Douglas is urging, and who Douglas really at one point thinks will be an ally, turns out to be a white supremacist president along the lines of Buchanan. And this isn't like I'm insulting him. This was his self-understanding that he was a white supremacist president. He believed in the end of slavery, the 13th Amendment, but he resisted any call for equal protection and certainly for the equal right to vote for black Americans. And so the checks here were supposed to be impeachment, but that doesn't work. Impeachment has never worked. You saw it in the two impeachments of of President Trump, including in the January 6th case. There just weren't the votes. It's an ineffective mechanism given the partisanship of Congress. So where does the recovery come from? Not from these checks and balances. And that's the loaded gun part. That's why when he says, Patrick Henry really predicted this in an eerie way, that the president is, unstoppable, especially a criminal president. The founders assume somebody of virtue, a good person. But what if a bad person takes office? You're not ready for that. That was Henry's warning. And he's right when it comes to the things that we learned about in grade school. And the book is partly about that threat. But where is the real check on a president who threatens democracy and could destroy it, by the way? As if Adams would have won re-election, if that plot would have worked, if the newspaper editors hadn't uncovered it, we might never have had multi-party democracy. None of this would have happened. We wouldn't be talking about America as even resembling a democracy. So where was the check? The check was from these citizens, the newspaper editors, Frederick Douglass, the heroes of the civil rights movement, like Sadie Alexander and before her, William Monroe Trotter and Ida B. Wells. And what was the mechanism that they used? It wasn't courts, it wasn't impeachment, it wasn't Congress, it was the election of recovery presidents, galvanizing their ideas of the Constitution behind those presidents. And that does work. So the loaded gun part is what we all learned about. That turns out, that's a big deal. You know, that's supposed to be the thing that saves us. It doesn't. I'm sorry to report that. It's only become worse. The Supreme Court, in its recent decision, as you may have heard, has just blown up even more what I'm talking about. And that fits the pattern that I'm talking about. They took the idea that some people held, and there was a big debate about it at the founding. People like James Wilson at the founding thought the president's not above the law. If you're president, you can still be indicted and go to prison. They brought that to a place that no founder had anticipated, and that's the idea that former presidents, at least when it comes to the official duties that they used while they were president, can't be stopped. But the official duties are the most dangerous ones. Think about January 6th. That's Trump's argument. That's an official duty. So that's the loaded gun part. But the other thing, the hopeful part, which I hope you hear and you see how it connects to the moment that we're living through, is these elections, 1800, 1868, these ideas of recovery and the galvanization of democratic constitutional constituencies behind recovery presidents, that's what's worked.
Okay, I do want to get to the constitutional constituencies, but I think we need to spend another moment on the Supreme Court. Yeah. Because it is unusual, actually, to read a book about constitutional ideas where the court plays not just a small role, but largely here a pretty terrible role. Yeah. And I guess that's also an echo of our current moment. Yes. Could you talk about the role of the Supreme Court in loading the loaded gun or in checking a president? And to that, I would add, that's, a lot of your story here is about the civil rights movement. And there, I think the usual view of the court is quite the opposite, that it was extremely helpful. So where does the court fit in?
That's right. And I don't want to say every moment of the Supreme Court has been bad, but at these crisis moments, it hasn't been the engine of recovery. That, I think, is true across them. So in the first, I mentioned Samuel Chase. Definitely not a good moment, made it worse. Joined in coalition with the crisis president of Adams to shut down the opposition party. The second, Buchanan, joining with the court to shut down literally all rights for Black Americans. As we get further along, Woodrow Wilson, still a moment in history of, and just to be clear, what Wilson does is he takes what is largely an integrated federal workforce and not only grows it, but segregates it. And the idea is that he's not just segregating the workforce, he's also spreading the idea. He talked about friction and the idea of friction, that this was the worst thing in a constitutional system. He rewrote the Constitution to make it only about efficiency. And so friction is the opposite of efficiency. What does that mean? By the way, I went into his students' lecture notes in Princeton. They preserve them. And this is part of why people don't know this, because when you read the notes, this is where you see a lot of this language. Friction is integration. If you allow it, it's going to create inefficiency. And what he's doing is he's not just working with the Supreme Court's idea there in Plessy versus Ferguson, but he's blowing it up. Now, what about the good cases? Because certainly there are good cases. There are two of them that I'll mention. You alluded to one, Brown versus Board of Education, of course, an extremely important decision, unanimous, reversing Plessy and the idea of separate but equal, which Wilson, by the way, in his argument with Trotter, he's confronted. It's not that people didn't call Wilson out in his own time on this. William Monroe Trotter says to Wilson in the White House, and leaks the transcript afterwards, it's how we know what happened, says to him, look, you are creating a system of second-class citizenship for Black Americans. And Wilson says back, well, if you believe that, that's in your head. And what he's doing is he's repeating the lie of Plessy, that segregation is not second-class citizenship. It's just separation. So the common story is that we recover in Brown. Now, here's what I say in the book. That's not that's sort of the end of the story. The beginning of the story, the first recovery happens when Harry Truman, someone who's chosen because of his racism, reportedly, according to his family, and this reassured those in the Roosevelt administration who wanted a vice president who would reassure Southern Democrats, use the N-word on a regular basis. And yet, the NAACP, led by Walter White, go to him and try, as they had with FDR and failed, and say, we really need to recover from Plessy. We need a recovery again around all three branches, to recover from Wilson's executive order in the federal government, to recover from Plessy, and to have legislation that finally brings about civil rights in this country. And they tell the story of black soldiers returning home from the war, being beaten in some cases to death and in some cases near to death. And it moves Truman, who is a decent person. And as he hears that story, he says, what do you want me to do? And Walter White is ready. He says, I want you to appoint not a court case, a committee of citizens. And the most important of those citizens, whom Walter White makes sure gets on that committee, is Sadie Alexander. What does Sadie Alexander do? She uses that committee to ensure that it is a blueprint for civil rights recovery, and a brilliant blueprint. She gets them to say that Plessy needs to be reversed, and that should be the policy of the federal government. That immediately, which Truman does, Wilson's executive actions have to be reversed through executive orders, integrating immediately the federal workforce, which he does immediately. And the third thing that she does, most important, which is opposed on the committee, and the only way she's able to get this into the report is by calling on, it's an amazing story that I found in the archives in the University of Pennsylvania, is by convincing Eleanor Roosevelt to convince her son, FDR Jr., to go along, to switch his vote, and to support this proposal that I'm about to tell you about. The proposal is, Sadie Alexander, by the way, is the first black woman in the United States to receive a PhD in economics. And she uses that idea of incentives to come up with a notion and to defend it in the report that says, if any school denies the right of integration, then they should lose their federal funding. That becomes Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's the thing that worked most in integration. Political scientists, and Emily knows this, but we'll share it with you, have done a lot of research on what worked in integrating America. And Brown, as important as it is symbolically, doesn't hold a candle to the thing that Sadie Alexander fought for, the use of incentives, the withdrawal of money, carrots and sticks, that is Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. She fights for that. Yet you've never heard her name. You've all heard of Earl Warren, and that's who we saw. It's not Earl Warren that really is responsible for America's recovery from Wilson. It's Sadie Alexander.
So if the court can't do as much good as we think, does that mean it also can't do as much harm, or is it asymmetrical? It can do a lot of harm, but not that much good.
Yeah, I think it's asymmetrical, unfortunately, because what it's done, I mean, let's take the other case, you know, a case that I wish I could tell you is so wonderful. And it is a great case. It's a great moment. I interviewed Philip Lacavara, who is the most senior living prosecutor who was working on the investigation of Nixon with the grand jury. And the grand jurors in that case, who I interviewed and then also found archival interviews with them, voted in a straw poll to indict Nixon. Elaine Edlund, one of the jurors, raises two hands, she says, and many others did, to show their enthusiasm for indicting Richard Nixon. And yet they're stopped. Why are they stopped? A deal is made. The deal is we'll go to court, in this case becomes U.S. versus Nixon, to get more tapes, make sure that Nixon hands everything over. We'll hand it over to Congress, and after Congress, through the impeachment process, removes Nixon, then we'll do the indictment. The plan worked. U.S. versus Nixon demanded the tapes. They handed over this information to Congress, but then the pardon comes and cuts off that possible indictment. But still you might say, well, U.S. versus Nixon is pretty good. Unfortunately, what we just saw, and I wish I was wrong about this in the thesis, but is in the immunity decision, they draw on U.S. versus Nixon's category of executive privilege, which is preserved, and blow it up to create an immunity. Now, that's not what the case was supposed to be about, but even cases that are supposed to be good cases can be used to, in this case, do great harm, because it is asymmetrical, because even though the court hasn't, unfortunately, been a huge driver of American democracy, it can be a destroyer of it when it's working in combination with presidential power.
I promise this is my last court question. What about freedom of speech? Because you talk in the first chapter about Adams, how the people who challenge this first Sedition Act aren't doing it in court. They're doing it through newspapers and with juries. But the court eventually does become a major proponent and defender of a kind of absolutist version of the First Amendment. Is that the exception here, or is that part of your same story?
It does. I mean, one thing I want to say is there's a right to dissent in the United States before the court in the 20th century starts to really defend it. Even when it defends it, I'll be critical here, it sometimes does and sometimes doesn't. And in fact, it has a pattern of allowing limits when it comes to leftist speech and not allowing it when it comes to the most extreme right-wing speech, for instance, the protection of the Klan in the Brandenburg case. But there was free speech in America before that. There's a tradition of free speech. I'd say there's an ethos of free speech, and that, I think, is due to the newspaper editors. There is a recovery from the Sedition Act in the election of Jefferson. Jefferson says in the second inaugural, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. That's well known, but what's less understood is really what he's saying is, I'm not going to have a new Sedition Act. I'm moving away from the attempt to destroy the opposition that you got during Adams. But Jefferson, as we know, is in some ways a horrible person. Of course, when it comes to the issue of enslavement, that's the most well-known. But even on free speech, he secretly does seek the prosecution of opponents. So he's come some of the way in publicly pronouncing the norm. But the incredible moment happens during the Madison presidency. And what happens during the Madison presidency is during the War of 1812, there is a call for a new Sedition Act. And the argument is, this isn't like Adams, it's war. And here, Adams refuses. He resists. And that moment, I think, crystallizes the idea that just becomes popularized, becomes not just part of what the court does in the 20th century, but part of the ethos that says you have a right to criticize the president. Saturday Night Live is not a crime in the way that it would have been in 1798 and 1799. And that's why I think the kind of broader idea of free speech is there. But let's not be fooled. It's under threat. If you look at Project 2025, they have carefully looked at the court's cases and seen the holes. And so when it comes, for instance, to what they call Marxists, which really they mean anyone to the left of them, trying to come into the United States, they want to shut that down based purely on belief. And they found a case that would allow them to do that about speech rights outside the country. Clarence Thomas has really said, and I could talk about how, but that the Sedition Act was basically constitutional. All the First Amendment meant, and there's a series of very conservative legal scholars saying this, all the First Amendment meant was, it was consistent with the idea that the king couldn't be criticized. And maybe you couldn't stop publication ahead of time, but you could certainly punish bad publication. So that's worrying, but I think it hasn't come in court. And I don't trust this court, actually, to defend it in the most important moments. It's come from the citizenry.
Okay, back to hope. So, so the citizenry, the court isn't our answer. The citizenry is where we have to look. And here, I think, is where you introduce this notion of a constitutional constituency. Can you tell us what that is, how we know one, how we form one?
And, the point of the book, just to say it, the hopeful part, is that at this moment in history, we'll start to look to the past for an inspiration for what's coming. And I, for one, am starting to feel inspiration based on the news of the last couple of days. We're starting to see it. But let's look at the past to see how it was done. So the first thing is resistance, that the newspaper editors do not just accept their own prosecutions. They try to figure out how, they know they're not going to go to court and succeed, because the guy sitting on the bench has been lobbying for these acts. They know that he's on the side of this president. So what did they do? They turned their own trials. They published the transcripts of the trials. They double down on their criticism of a president. And in so doing, they grow their readership. And they start to turn that into a platform for the 1800 election. Presidents at that time don't campaign in the way that they do now. Jefferson gave like one speech and then thought better of it. It's really done by the citizenry. And so these newspaper editors are out there having events and publishing the idea that the thing that's wrong with this president, with Adams, despite the fact that he is the premier constitutional thinker of his time, is that he doesn't understand the simple words of the newly passed First Amendment, the right to free speech. The right to free speech, they say, is about a right to dissent, a right to criticize a president. So the point is, they take a constitutional idea, they champion it, they put it in opposition, and then they get a constituency behind them. And most importantly, they find a candidate that they can support, that they're then going to hold to account. And that continues to happen. So take Douglas, who really champions Grant. But why does Grant do what he does? It's so little known. And of course, part of Grant's history was rewritten by Woodrow Wilson and his fellow historians to try to, the one thing you've heard about Grant is that he's a drunk. Why do you think that when you think about Grant? There was a lot of drinking by a lot of presidents in the 19th century. It's very common. It's because they're trying to destroy the idea that this was a recovery president. And so what happens in 1868, largely at the behest of Douglas, is that Grant is elected on this promise to shut down the most dangerous network of terrorists in the United States at that time, which is the Ku Klux Klan and related groups. And the passage of the Enforcement Act, the creation of the Department of Justice as an institution that is going to go around prosecuting members of the Klan who are engaged in political terrorism. All of that doesn't happen by accident. It happens as a result of Douglas's efforts through networks of meetings, through his speeches, through his writings, around a very specific idea, a concept, which is that the constitutions, we the people, the democracy, is about equal citizenship. Now, in our current moment, there was an attempt to do this. And as Emily says, the one difference of the Nixon era is that I argue we really haven't recovered from Nixon yet. But the hope is that we could recover. Now, what is it that we have to recover? The pardon really cut off the possibility of American people seeing the crimes of Richard Nixon and watching him treated in accordance with a simple principle that no person is above the law. So a constituency that would start to lobby for that idea, I think, is part of what's needed here. And that means not just defeating Trump. Obviously, that's part of what I'm talking about in the book. But it means that whoever the next president is, that this constituency, whoever the people are, and they haven't emerged yet, but I think they need to. And part of what I'm doing in writing the book and in gathering us today is to talk about what this is about, is to hold that next president to account, to demand restoration of this idea. Now, how could you do that? One thing would be ordinary legislation that would define the official acts that are protected from prosecution in a very narrow way. That would be one way to do it. Another way would be to appoint justices and to add justices to the court who would uphold such legislation, or uphold, even better, a reversal of Trump versus the United States, holding that presidents can't be prosecuted for their official duties. Another thing that should happen, and this was an attempt to do it, the grand jurors who I interviewed, it's not that they were forgotten completely. There was an act in Congress called the Protect Grand Jury Act that was eventually passed in during Carter in 1976, called the Ethics in Government Act, and it provided for an independent counsel. This is going to sound a little wonky, but stick with me because it's crucial. As many of you will remember, during Watergate, Richard Nixon fires Archibald Cox because he's getting too close to indicting him. And he replaces him with Leon. He fires him. For a while, he's hoping the whole issue will just go away. And then the firing takes place in one Saturday night. He tells Elliot Richardson, the Attorney General, fire Cox. Richardson actually refuses, a hero. He fires Richardson. Ruckelshaus, the deputy, becomes the Attorney General. He tells Ruckelshaus, fire Cox. He refuses. And Robert Bork, third in line, Solicitor General, he says, fire Cox. And he says, aye, aye, sir. How could that happen? Fire the person looking into your wrongdoing. And by the way, that leads eventually to the appointment of Jaworski, who, as I told you, blocked the pardon. How could that happen? It happened because the person charged under that system, and rush to where we are now, we have the same system now, that person, the special prosecutor investigating the president's crimes, works for the president. And so the president, through this mechanism of threatening the Attorney General, can fire that person. What the Protect Grand Jury Act, called the Ethics in Government, did for a brief period of time is it cut that possibility off. It took the investigator outside the White House, put it in an independent branch, and according to that office, they had the ability to indict a president. There's a Department of Justice policy that says you can't indict a president. They said the opposite of what the court did. Yes, a sitting president, not just a former, definitely a former president, but even a sitting president. What happened to that? Well, this is a bipartisan story because during the Clinton administration, Clinton started off talking about how great this law was. It will stop another Saturday Night Massacre. It will stop Nixon's attempt to quash investigations of him, of the president. But when Ken Starr came close to indicting Clinton, he let the law expire, ensured it would expire. And we went right back to the system where the president can fire the investigator. That's what happened during Mueller. The only reason Mueller didn't indict Trump, and he says this in the part 2 of the report, is because of the Department of Justice's policy that sitting presidents can't be indicted. He was working for the president and so couldn't indict him. That's what he said. So here's the point. We need new laws. We need an independent prosecutor law. We need to reverse this immunity case. And that won't happen just with the election defeat of Trump. It has to happen with a constituency pushing, as we did in the past, for a real recovery.
So this makes me wonder about, as you're describing a constituency, I'm hearing two things I wonder if are really in there. One is it can't just be a group of people advancing an idea, but they need to coalesce around a candidate who's going to promote that idea. Is that in there? And then the second question is, how narrow does that idea need to be? Because I think we are often familiar with broad coalitions that are sort of generally on the same page but disagree about a matter of priorities. You seem here to be emphasizing a sort of single priority, which is you could describe as rule of law, maybe. Is that the plan here? We need a presidential candidate to mobilize around, and we need to make our whole goal reestablishing rule of law, especially as it relates to the president?
Yeah, I'd say what we learned from the past, and by the way, I think the rule of law is a huge part, I'd put it first, but I think we have to think about the right to dissent in a serious way, given Trump's comments, and we have to certainly think about equal citizenship, given the way the court has eviscerated it in cases like Shelby County and elsewhere, and the way that Trump, January 6th, case in point, but other places, was really destroying the basic idea of equal citizenship. But what all three of these ideas have in common is they're fundamental pillars. I talk about them as the pillars of democracy. What's a pillar of democracy? It's an idea, a narrow one to some degree, focused on a particular area, and there are three specific ones: right to dissent, equal citizenship, and the rule of law, the idea that no person is above the law. We need to galvanize around them, but that's not enough. It can't just be abstract. In all of these cases, and that's why I went a little wonky with the details of the Ethics in Government Act, it's got to come with concrete proposals of recovery. So yes, they had these principles, but they weren't campaign speeches. They weren't just sitting there like, la-di-da, we believe in the right to dissent. They were talking about rights to express any viewpoint, even if it was a viewpoint against the president. The right of an opposition party to exist. In equal citizenship, the idea of a right to vote free from violence. Not just some abstract principle, but they were calling Douglas and his constituency for these enforcement acts, including the most famous of them, called the Ku Klux Klan Act, which still in large part exists today. And then in the third instance, in the Nixon instance, the sort of untold story of these grand jurors, what they were demanding was a simple common sense thing. When I asked Ethel Peoples, who called me during COVID at 11 at night, but I was so thrilled to hear, I woke right up when she called, who I had been trying to find, she just said, basically, it was the most common sense and important and eloquent statement that he committed a crime, he should be treated like everyone else, meaning the president, Nixon. Ethel Peoples worked as a janitorial worker in a hospital, but yet she just insisted that the president of the United States was not above her. He committed a crime. They saw the evidences of the crime, and he should be prosecuted. So it's a combination of the principle and concrete action of how you achieve it. Sadie Alexander, as I mentioned, Title VI, that's an amazing achievement. The thing, not just a principle, but a concrete proposal, a law that exists. Look it up if you don't know what I'm talking about. This is the thing that really did a lot to desegregate America.
So this makes me wonder about the media environment, because many of the people, the leaders of these constitutional constituencies in your story are either journalists or at the head of newspapers or information gathering and publicity not in a sort of callow sense, but get the word out about this problem and the solution we propose. Is the media environment so different and maybe so fractured now that this kind of politics has become harder, if not impossible?
It's a great question, and I see the problem. We do live in a fractured environment. And in some of the cases, in the Nixon example, the fact that so many people watched the Watergate hearings, that had a role in his stepping down, even though we never fully recovered. But in the other instances, they were fractured media too. The media in 1798, newspaper editors that I'm talking about, didn't speak to all of America. They were speaking to a small segment, and yet they were able to get this idea out. Frederick Douglass's circulation, he had several different publications, including the North Star and Frederick Douglass's paper. They're in the thousands, not in the tens of thousands, not in the millions, certainly, not in the hundreds. So yes, it's fractured, but it was fractured then, and it still worked. So that's why I'm confident that, yes, we are in a fractured environment, and that's different from the Nixon era, but it's not different from many of these other eras. I'll mention, too, the NAACP and its publications. It's not that they have a huge readership across America, but they're getting these ideas out. And that gives me hope for this moment, too.
Okay, I think I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll be able to open it up to all of you to ask Corey your questions. But I guess my last question is about, it's returning to this theme of hope, but it's about a lot of cynicism about the Constitution generally. And I think this is even more on the left than on the right, potentially. I think the right is, sort of Trump's call to abolish the Constitution, you could call anti-constitutional, but on the left too. People are writing, look, we're stuck with this very old white supremacist document, and it enshrines this Supreme Court we can't seem to get a hold of. We have an electoral college that's distorted our elections. And looks to the many of the same incidents you do to say we're stuck with a really problematic document. Yeah. We have to get over our veneration of this document, either amend it or just sort of look somewhere else. And you seem to me to tell a very different story. Yeah. You say, no, it's people who believed in the Constitution that are our salvation. So how can you square kind of all of these constitutional problems that I think the left very rightly points to as real pathologies in our system with what is a story about the power of constitutional ideas and of believing in the Constitution?
Yeah, and I am in large part, really a great point, because what I'm trying to do in large part is respond to that kind of cynicism that says, let's get rid of this document. And it's not that there is an American history of people saying that. So Frederick Douglass is opposed by his former mentor, Lloyd Garrison, who believes the Constitution isn't just bad, it's a pact with the devil and it should be burned. And let's just jettison it entirely. But what the book tells a story of is these heroes who saw things a different way, and they won. That's the key. This worked. It's not just me saying, here are my ideas as a professor. You should really believe in this democratic idea of the Constitution. It has 3 components. No, it's that the newspaper editors fought back and won a right to dissent. Frederick Douglass saw the threat to democracy and fought back and won the right of equal political citizenship. Of course, these things are always vulnerable, but achieved an amazing thing during the Grant administration. Sadie Alexander in Title VI, Martin Luther King in the pushing for Title VI's enactment in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, did so through the language of constitutionalism. King, as I tell this story, in the beginning really talked like a theologian. He spoke about natural law, but as he engaged actually with a student critic, and it's an amazing fact that he really listened to the students, like writing them these annoying letters about how he should talk about the Constitution, not natural law, really comes to see that the anti-tyranny principle of the founders is the message of the civil rights movement, uses that effectively against Southern segregationists who claim, well, the Constitution allows segregation, and reclaims the Constitution for the American people. So it's not my story or me that you should listen to. It's Frederick Douglass, who should be regarded, by the way, as the true founder of American democracy. It's these newspaper editors. It's William Monroe Trotter. It's Sadie Alexander, who I hope you'll read about. And it's, of course, Martin Luther King in this moment of seeing the idea that he says, somewhere I read about a right to dissent. Somewhere I read about the idea of equality. And we know where he read it. That's the point of the speech. It's the last speech he gives, actually, before he's assassinated. It's a speech about the Constitution. So these aren't my ideas. I'm trying to give voice to the ideas of these heroes, citizens who really recovered the Constitution when a president and a court would otherwise have destroyed it.
Thanks, Corey. Can we turn things over to the audience?
What would you say about the role of capital and money in influencing court decisions and how we promote our politicians?
I think that's certainly an issue, and one of the things that a constitutional constituency, I think, needs to call for going forward is to hold the Supreme Court to the same standard that every other court except the Supreme Court is held to, and that's a binding set of ethical requirements. And it's an outrage that justices can receive money, essentially bribes, without being called to an account because of their lifetime appointment, and it only can be removed through the impeachment and removal process of Congress, which is, as I've said, very hard to use, especially in regard to a Supreme Court justice. So there are things that can be done, though. And one of them, the simple thing, is hold Supreme Court justices to account, same account that we hold lower court justices to. That's not enough. I mean, I think this court in the immunity decision has really endangered democracy. That I don't think Sotomayor's dissent is an exaggeration. They've really made a self-coup, political assassination. All of these things are potentially legal. All of Nixon's crimes, his whole point was that what he was doing was legal because he was the president and it was official duty. And he said, we're in a civil war with the protesters. I need to do these things. I need to shut down Daniel Ellsberg. So it's partly the reform of the role of money in the court, but it's also much more. It's really replacing with a new set of justices or just enlarging the court to drown out their voices, a democratic constitution.
Thank you. I find your research fascinating. I think it was Brian Lair's show or one of the other shows I heard you on last week, and that's why I'm here. Excellent work. As you were doing your research and kind of going back through the annals of history and this idea of recovery, I do understand that a lot of it happened through heroics. But did you get any examples of a systemic power of recovery, of many people working together, or activism, or even modern day activism that you were impressed by?
Well, I think yes, I think it's always a network. There were leaders, and I do think they were heroic, and that's why I want to say it's not inevitable that these things are going to happen. I wish I would have found, and I wish I could reassure you in the following way. American democracy has this guaranteed mechanism that's going to work in the instance of crisis, is that citizens are going to rise up in these constitutional constituencies and elect a recovery president, but that's just not the case. It's that there were extraordinary people, and there are not a lot of Frederick Douglasses. So that is worrying. But they did pop up. They did emerge. And this goes to your question, didn't emerge alone. They were always working in coalitions. One thing that's interesting, I really wanted to highlight Sadie Alexander. I talked about her in depth today, the Title VI idea, how she fought for it. Because even though she was a hero, she was a behind-the-scenes hero. So we've heard of King, of course. We've heard of Frederick Douglass. The newspaper editors, we haven't heard of them usually, but they were very famous in their day. Thomas Cooper would have been somebody that you knew about. But it's also the combination of those public figures and those really working behind the scenes. And so Sadie Alexander did so much that just is completely unknown. And it's only because I sat there reading letter after letter and seeing what she was doing through this amazing archive at Penn that you see that the contribution, it does require heroics, but not always of the same kind. And so some of the heroes, I think, are unsung. They're working quietly. One thing it does require, though, is, it's not mechanistic, the recovery. It only happens when citizens rise up, when they feel that energy and start to act. And short of that, my worry is there might not have been recoveries in these instances.
Can I interject? What action, I'm sitting here inspired. Actually, the book is very inspiring. You read it and you think, what can I do? but can you help answer that? What, this sort of everyday people, what do we do?
Well, I think part of it is starting to think about the concrete thing that we want from the next president. First of all, I think the most immediate thing. I don't want to be shy about this. This isn't a book that's like, and the recovery of the Constitution is a neutral idea that has nothing to do with politics or partisanship. No, these were partisan moments. The resistance to the Federalist Party, which really was an authoritarian party, and thankfully was destroyed as a result of the election of 1800 and the aftermath. The destruction of Buchanan's version of the Democratic Party, which was a claimed to be neutral, but was certainly a pro-slavery party. That's needed at this moment. Trumpism is not compatible with democracy. It is an authoritarian idea. So part of what I'm talking about is the defeat of Trumpism. But then I'm also saying it's not enough, because Nixon did get defeated. He did leave office, and I was on with Michael Steele on Sunday and talking about this, and they were saying to me, he and his co-host, isn't it the case that in that moment that Congress did its job? And my answer is and was, it did its job, yes. We got rid of that president by threatening his impeachment, but the fact was that we never ensured a real recovery going forward. That's really what I'm talking about too. That the next president of the United States, assuming it's not Trump, if it's Trump, we're going to have a different story that we're going to have to talk about. It's a story of resistance. But if Trump is defeated, it's not enough that they take the presidency. It's that this idea that no person is above the law has to be restored. And that's the thing that we've got to focus on.
In the immunity decision, the Supreme Court remanded the case to the district court to make a distinction between official and unofficial acts.
Right. Correct.
I think the trial court judge has got a lot of responsibility, but if I were in that person's shoes, I wouldn't have too much difficulty saying that what he did was not an official act. There's nothing in the law, as far as I know, that gives the president the authority to interfere with the electoral college count, which is what he did. So I don't think all is lost by the Supreme Court's decision.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to put a little bit of a damper on what I wish I could say what you're saying. The first thing is, the reason it doesn't make sense to think that January 6th is an official act is because the idea of an official criminal act altogether doesn't make sense. An official duty isn't a crime. A crime is the absence of an official duty. That's the first suspicion. Here's the other problem. I do think that's what's going to happen. They sent it back. They said that President Trump is immune from prosecution if January 6th and the attempt to stop the election, the obstruction of Congress, is an official act. But if it's not an official act, he's not immune. The lower court judge will say, the trial court judge, I'm confident what you said, it's definitely not an official act. But then it's going to go right back to the Supreme Court. Why would they have set it up this way? For the first time in American history, suggested that a president is immune, former president, for an official act if they weren't getting ready to either do one of two things, to either protect him or, and this is another way to do it, slow roll the decision so much that it'll never be heard. Because if they can slow it down enough, and we're getting close, and Trump wins, he's immune. There's no question, there's absolute immunity for sitting presidents under Trump versus the United States. So I really, I teach constitutional law. I teach it in this way to try to give the best understanding of what the court is doing. But in this case, what I think they're doing, unfortunately, what they have done is they slowed things down so much that they've essentially protected him. Unless he loses. And then maybe, maybe they'll come down on the side of saying it was an official act. I'm skeptical of that because I don't see why they would have introduced it now. Right, but who's going to make the decision in the end? And the other question is, why would a court, this is, just to back up a little bit, there has long been a debate, very serious debate, about whether or not a sitting president has immunity. And at the founding, there was a disagreement. So not surprisingly, John Adams, who we've been talking about, said sitting president, he never said a former president, sitting president is immune from prosecution. Very important founder named James Wilson from Pennsylvania said at the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention, president's not immune. A president can be prosecuted because a president's a citizen like anyone else. No person is above the law. But what nobody said was that former presidents have immunity, because the Constitution in its impeachment clause talks about the fact that after impeachment, a president can be prosecuted. So what the Supreme Court has done here, it's really a lawless decision in its, and you've said it exactly right, language of presumption, distinction between official and unofficial duty. It leaves outs in which he might still be prosecuted for January 6th. But what's dangerous about it is that they've created this whole new category of immunity for former presidents. And they've done it at a time when a president is being prosecuted for what was obviously not an official duty. And they could have easily said what you just heard, this wasn't an official duty, or the presumption is overcome by a concern about security. They didn't do that. They delayed, as they did actually even in deciding the case. They could have decided this case as they did the Colorado case almost immediately. So they delay. They send it back, and if he wins, it's over because he'll have immunity. The court, unfortunately, sounds sophisticated, and we've gone back and forth and gotten into the details pretty well of the opinion, but it is acting not just in a political way, but as it often has, in a partisan way, while masking it very carefully in nuanced kind of languages.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, hi. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey at the time of the uprisings, or what they called race riots. And the through line of my life has been from the failing of us dealing with the uprisings to being in a civil war. We're in a civil war. It's just a question of how violent it's going to get and when it will get violent. But the through line of my life is the through line of America's life, which is white racism, white supremacy. So it's probably a better question for a psychologist, but why do white people fear and hate black people so much? Because that's the through line of this country.
I think, and what I didn't want to do, and I don't think I do in the book, is hide from that fact, that there really are two constitutions in the United States, and there have been since the founding. One is the Constitution of Frederick Douglass, who I called the founder of American democracy. And the other has a very different idea. The idea is of an authoritarian ruler who can shut down the opposition. And the other idea, which you see over and over again in Andrew Johnson, in Buchanan, even in Lincoln to some degree in the beginning before he's transformed in the dialogues with Frederick Douglass, is the idea that there are second-class and first-class citizens. And certainly in Wilson you see it explicitly in a frightening way. And so it isn't just a pathology, although it is that. It's a constitutional, a horrible, evil idea that you see too. The most notorious case of the Supreme Court, the Dred Scott case, says what I'm talking about. If you read it, that's it. So it's partly that it's a pathology. It's also that it is a constitutional idea. Now, thankfully, it's not the only one. There is a democratic constitution that has repeatedly been vindicated. At the founding, the fight against Adams, the fight against Buchanan, the fight against Andrew Johnson, the fight against Wilson, and the continuing fight against not just Trump, but Nixon. And that's a fight worth not violently trying to support, but through democratic processes. It's worked. That thing is there, and we can revive it. Let me end by talking about the grand jurors. These were, as I said, average citizens of Washington, D.C., racially diverse in terms of gender. What did Richard Nixon's press secretary, Pat Buchanan, say about them? He said, these are people who hate the president because he's white. He turned it into a battle between white and black. When all these people were doing, this diverse group was doing, was trying to recover a democratic constitution. But what Patrick Buchanan, who of course runs on a Trump-like platform years later for president of the United States himself, what he's trying to do is to tap into that authoritarian constitution. And I'm not denying it. It is a huge part of America, not just in the 60s, going back to the beginning. It has never gone away. And you see it being revived over and over again. Project 2025, some of the court's recent decisions and voting rights and other areas, revive it. But there is a way to push back short of giving up on the Constitution or handing it over to the authoritarians. And that's to push in favor of a democratic idea of the Constitution.
Well, thank you, Corey, for this fantastic discussion and this very important book.
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for these great questions. Thank you to Emily. I think she lived up to all my hype.